Okay. Another point is just with regard to the itmi'nan, the ease of the heart, that it increases our confidence of the precise preservation of the Quran, that the Sahaba and the scholars after them could say where and when the various verses of the Quran were revealed. You have a quote from Abdullah bin Mas'ud that he said, I know when and where every verse in the Quran was revealed. So the care that was taken by them with regard to those issues is something that's it has a repercussion upon our certainty about the preservation of the Quran. Now, our next issue is then, how can you tell the difference? Well, the first criterion is statements of the Sahaba. And now, with regard to Abdullah bin Mas'ud, not all of his knowledge regarding that has been transmitted. I mean, there are 6,000 some odd verses, and we don't have 6,000 some narrations from Abdullah bin Mas'ud. This verse was revealed here, this verse was revealed there. However, we do have some statements from some of the Sahaba about specific verses, about when and where they were revealed. Then you also have statements from the Tabi'een. Now, in the absence of a statement from the Sahaba, and you have a statement from a Tabi'i, and particularly if the Tabi'i is known for TAFSIIR, then that, it's la ba'sa bihi. I mean, as long as there's nothing to conflict with it, other evidence that would weaken that appraisal, then that's worthy of consideration. And there's, for example, there was a man who asked Ikrimah, the freed slave of Ibn Abbas, about a certain ayah. This was in Medina, and he pointed at Jabal Salah, which is not far from the Prophet's Masjid. And he said it was revealed on top of that hill. Then, if there are no reports, athar, then there are certain criteria which are characteristic of Makkan surahs and verses, and there are certain criteria which are characteristic of Madeenan surahs and verses, and we can make ijtihad based upon these distinctive characteristics. So what are those distinctive features? Well, the most important thing is themes, and then you get some very detailed sort of features. So with regard to the Makkan surahs, obviously the main concern of the Makkan surahs are Tawheed, Nubuwah, and Akhirah. So these three concerns are the dominant topics of Makkan surahs, establishing that there is only one God and that we are totally indebted to Him, and our success and our well-being and the realization of the purpose for which we were created it all lies in worshiping that one God. So that's Tawheed. The Risala or the Nubuwah is establishing that Muhammad was indeed sent by God, by Allah. And Akhirah, that every person will die and then we'll be resurrected and we'll face reckoning on the day of judgment, and then an eternity in heaven or hell. So those are the main themes. Now, obviously, you're going to find some of that also in Madeenan surahs, but as a proportion of concern, it becomes less related to other concerns. And with regard to fiqh issues, of course, it's very well known that the Madeenan surahs are filled with fiqh verses that have fiqh applications. The Meccan verses, when they deal with fiqh, it's dealing basically in generalities. Some principles, usul, the broad outlines of fiqh are laid down. There seems to be substantial concern with dietary issues. As far as fiqh goes, the most detail in the Meccan surahs relates to dietary issues. You'll find that particularly in Surah Al-An'am, and in Al-An'am and then in Al-A'raf, with regard to the usul, you have certain proposals that have been laid down, such as nothing is prohibited without specific evidence. No one has a right to declare things lawful or unlawful except Allah, and people, they have to submit to what is explicit, and in areas which are not completely laid out, then they have to refer back to the principles that Allah has revealed in order to try to determine what's lawful and unlawful. And also, there's a strong indicator that Allah's legislation is based upon hikmah, upon wisdom and the consideration of the well-being, the maslaha, the benefits for the subject of his legislation, which is human beings. So, for instance, there's a verse that says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وقالوا ما في بطون هذه الأنعام خالصة لذكورنا ومحرم على أزواجنا وإن يكن ميتة فهم فيه شركاء سيجزيهم وصفهم إنه حكيم عليم. So this is talking about the mushriks. They say, what is in the bellies of such cattle is reserved for our males and is forbidden to our wives. But if it be born dead, then they all may partake of it. So this is their quote. And then Allah goes on to comment, He will reward them for their attribution of such ordinances to Him. He will, in other words, not reward them with good, but punish them. He will requite them. Lo, He is wise, aware. So in other words, these rules that they're attributing to Allah are completely nonsensical. There's no rhyme or reason to them. They're so just completely arbitrary and silly. And so for them then to turn around and attribute that to Allah is it's an insult and a provocation against Allah. And so, of course, that implies that Allah is wise and aware in what He legislates. And so there's a good reason for everything that He decrees. And, that may or may not be known to us, but that is the basic rule. Now, another feature of the Meccan surahs is that a great focus was laid upon basic morality, that qualities, character traits, what is called akhlaq in Arabic, the basic commendable character traits are identified and discussed repeatedly. So qualities such as mercy, compassion, justice, steadfast perseverance, piety, humility, these are again and again held up as the ideal for which people should strive, that they should attempt to inculcate these in their being, and then the condemnation of negative traits, negative qualities such as injustice, oppression, corruption, and inflicting of harm. Now, a fourth major concern of the Makkan surahs is the stories of the prophets, the previous prophets, and their communities. And, these are repeatedly reviewed as examples to draw lessons from, and it's what's called tasrif al-ayat. It's like turning a multifaceted jewel so that you see facet upon facet. So different aspects, for instance, of the story of Musa are highlighted in one surah, and other aspects are highlighted in other surahs, depending upon the overall objective of that surah. So these stories were intended for object lessons, and they were also intended to strengthen the resolve and the morale of the Prophet ﷺ and his followers, because case after case where the opponents of the prophets, they punish them and inflict great harm upon them and their followers, and then in the end the prophet is vindicated, and those who rejected his message and persecuted him and his followers are destroyed. So constantly being reminded about that in a situation where the whole world is against the Muslims, that in that situation it instilled this tremendous resolve to bear up under hardship and suffering. And then the other major feature of the Meccan surahs and verses is that they're short. And the imagery is vivid. And that was a necessity of the target audience. The vast majority of the people of Mecca were hostile to the message. And so once they start hearing it, it's like, we don't want to hear that, and they would turn and leave. So before they get away, you have to zing it into them, basically. And so the verses were very short, so that they would hear something. The ideas were complete in those short verses. So they would hear something that would lodge in their minds. And because of the power and the vividness of those verses, you have incident related in the Seerah of Ibn Hisham where the leaders of the Meccan opposition, they would sneak at night to Dar al-Arqam and sort of eavesdrop outside, because even though they didn't want to submit to the message, it was intriguing. And so they would catch each other sneaking up to eavesdrop there, and of course, this was unacceptable socially within their group. So they would make each other pledge that they wouldn't do it again, and then later on they would catch each other again eavesdropping. Now, as far as some of these little fine points of detailed indicators. You have a number of them. One is that every surah containing the word kalla is Makkan. It appears 33 times in 15 different surahs. And the word kalla basically means no way. It's a word of repudiation and challenge, which is appropriate to the obstinacy and the arrogance of the Meccans. It's something that they stated in the course of discussion and debate would be recounted, and Allah would quote them basically and their attitudes, and then he would repudiate it with kalla. And every surah containing a prostration is considered to be Meccan. Every surah starting with the muqatta'at, those individual letters, alif, lam, mim, they're Meccan except for Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran. And the story of Adam and Iblis is a feature of the Meccan surahs, again with the exception of Al-Baqarah. And a surah that contains Ya ayyuhan nas and doesn't contain Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu, that's a Meccan surah. Also, surahs that mention the hur'een, using that wording, are Meccan surahs. And this is a point that Amina Wadud, she called particular attention to that in her book on Quran and women. And perhaps we'll have time to discuss her book at greater length later. And almost all of the Mufassal surahs, the Mufassal surahs they start with Qaf and they end with Nas. So from Qaf to the end of the Quran, those are the Mufassal surahs. And because they're relatively short compared to the others, that almost all of those are Meccan.